Ladies and gentlemen, there is a peculiar moment in the journey of the self when silence becomes more eloquent than speech, and withdrawal more courageous than pursuit. This is the hour when the soul, wearied by endless demands and scattered energies, begins to listen, not to the noise of the world, but to the faint murmurings of its own truth. We live under the illusion that availability is a virtue in and of itself, that to be open, reachable, and ever willing is the hallmark of love, duty, and relevance. But this is only half the truth. The other half, the half we often fear, is that withdrawal is not rejection, and silence is not absence. It is in the moment we stop being constantly available that the architecture of our reality begins to reveal its hidden scaffolding. To be endlessly available is to enter into a quiet and slow erosion of the self. This erosion does not happen dramatically, with explosions or grand collapses, but subtly over time, almost imperceptibly. It is the gradual wearing down of one's boundaries, the slow disintegration of the line that separates the inner world from the outer demands. Every time you say yes out of fear, obligation, or guilt, a small crack forms in the structure of your identity. These cracks do not scream, they whisper, but the psyche remembers. It keeps account. Availability, when unchecked, becomes a form of psychic leakage. We pour ourselves into everyone else's containers, yet find our own wells running dry. We offer time we do not have, energy we cannot spare, and presence we no longer truly feel. And in doing so, we confuse sacrifice with love, obligation with virtue, and depletion with worth. What lies beneath this persistent compulsion to be available is often a fear, ancient, deep-rooted, and inherited. The fear of not being needed, the fear of becoming invisible, the fear that without our usefulness we cease to matter. It is a psychological pattern that often begins in early life, where affection and approval were tied to performance, helpfulness, or emotional labor. Somewhere, the child learned that love was earned through service, and that to be unavailable was to be selfish or unworthy. That belief, unless challenged, calcifies into adulthood, manifesting in friendships, careers, and relationships where our availability is mistaken for identity. We become the helper, the fixer, the listener, the problem solver, the one who is always there, even when we are no longer truly present within ourselves. This perpetual responsiveness breeds a strange kind of internal split. We become outwardly active and inwardly absent. While we appear involved, we are, in truth, slowly disengaging from our own depths. The dreams grow quieter, the intuition dulls, the inner voice, once vibrant and alive, becomes faint beneath the constant noise of others' needs. We begin to live in reaction rather than reflection. It becomes difficult to discern what we desire from what is simply expected of us. Our calendars are full, but our spirits remain hollow. The self becomes a ghost in its own life story. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic is that it is often praised and rewarded. The world celebrates the ever-available, the one who picks up the phone at midnight, who says yes to every demand, who stretches themselves thin for the sake of others. But praise is not peace, and applause is not alignment. The constant external validation may feed the ego temporarily, but it cannot nourish the soul. Eventually, a reckoning arrives, not through a dramatic breakdown, but through a quiet fatigue, a chronic resentment, or a subtle numbness that grows too loud to ignore. In this reckoning, the question arises with piercing clarity: who am I, outside of who I've been for others? To ask this question is to stand at the threshold of transformation. But before any change can take place, there must be a recognition of how availability has become a mask, not a malicious one, but a protective one. A mask forged from the fear of disconnection, shaped by past wounds, and reinforced by cultural ideals that equate worth with constant doing. And to remove that mask, even slightly, is terrifying, because beneath it lies something raw, unfiltered, and true. something that does not seek to please, but to be, something that does not live for response, but for resonance. And in the space where availability once dominated, this emerging self waits, not to be everything for everyone, but to be whole, even in solitude when we step away from constant availability. What emerges is not the feared isolation or rejection we may have anticipated, but an unexpected and profound silence. This silence is not empty, but charged, almost electric, carrying within it the echoes of truths that have long been suppressed beneath the noise of routine responsiveness. It is in this quiet that things begin to reveal themselves, not just in others, but within us. The absence of external demands creates a vacuum into which the inner voice begins to rise. At first, it may speak hesitantly, as if unsure of its right to speak after years of being drowned out by urgency, obligation, and the clamor of other people's lives. But with time, that voice gathers strength, and it does not echo the familiar voices of those around us. It speaks a language we had forgotten we knew, one of instinct, insight, and memory this moment. When you stop answering every call, replying to every message, meeting every expectation, is not a withdrawal from connection, but an invitation to discernment. Without the usual noise, you begin to see patterns that were invisible before. You begin to notice who reaches out only when they need something, who becomes angry when you establish boundaries, who disappears when your energy is no longer freely given. People reveal their intentions not always through words, but through their responses to your silence. You begin to understand who was truly interested in your presence and who was merely feeding off your availability. The silence becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting back the emotional contracts you never consciously signed, the invisible roles you were cast into, the expectations that were woven into your identity without your awareness. This kind of seeing can be jarring. It disrupts illusions you may have held dear, ideas about loyalty, reciprocity, love. You start to notice how often you were expected to be the emotional anchor, the reliable one, the always, their friend or partner, while your own needs were left to fend for themselves. It becomes clear that your availability had become a currency, one you were trading for approval, affection, or a sense of belonging. But the silence teaches a harsher truth, that any relationship built on the condition of your constant presence may not have been a relationship at all, but a transaction, and this recognition is not meant to foster bitterness, but clarity. In the quiet, you learn not just who others are, but who you've become through your need to be everything for them. This moment is psychologically rich, because it marks a transition from projection to perception. When you are always immersed in the needs of others, you tend to project value where there is only dependence, loyalty where there is convenience, connection where there is merely repetition. In stepping away, the projections dissolve. You see more clearly. You see where you have abandoned yourself in order to be accepted. You see how often you've interpreted control as care, and how often your own longing to be chosen has led you to offer yourself without limits. Silence becomes your teacher, not in harshness, but in revelation. It does not accuse, it unveils, and in what it unveils there is pain, yes, but also liberation. The most vital realization in this process is not about others, but about yourself. You begin to feel the vast internal space that was previously crowded by the voices and needs of others. You begin to notice your own rhythms again, your own preferences, your forgotten dreams. The silence creates a clearing in the forest of your psyche where the self, long buried beneath layers of adaptation, begins to emerge. It is not yet fully formed, but it is present. And in this presence, a new relationship with time, energy, and attention begins to take root. A relationship governed not by compulsion, but by consciousness. A boundary is not an act of aggression, nor is it a wall designed to keep love out. It is, rather, the subtle architecture of the self, necessary form through which we come to know who we are in relation to others. Without boundaries, we become porous, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, absorbing the needs, moods, and projections of everyone around us until we no longer know where we end and others begin. The idea that love or compassion requires endless openness is one of the most persistent illusions we carry. But love without limits ceases to be love and becomes sacrifice, often unrecognized, often unappreciated, and ultimately unsustainable. Boundaries are not rejections of connection. They are the conditions under which real connection becomes possible, because only when we are distinct can we offer something whole and true to another. When you begin to set boundaries, even quietly, the world around you notices. Sometimes it resists, sometimes it recoils, and often it tests the strength of the new lines you've drawn. People who once benefited from your lack of limits may accuse you of changing, of becoming cold, distant, or selfish, not because you are any of those things, but because your compliance once supported the structure of their comfort. This discomfort is not your responsibility to soothe. It is a natural consequence of shifting roles, of stepping out of invisible contracts that once demanded your availability without question. What you are doing is not cruel, it is honest. You are saying, without raising your voice, that your time is not a communal property, your energy is not an infinite resource, and your presence is not a given, but a gift. This internal shift, this quiet reclaiming, alters how you move through the world. You no longer say yes to everything reflexively. You pause, you consider, and you listen inwardly before responding outwardly. That pause becomes a sacred space, a moment in which you remember that your needs matter too. Over time, this pause becomes your compass, and boundaries stop feeling like barricades and start feeling like breath. You begin to inhabit your own life with more depth, because you're no longer scattered across the lives of others. The more consistently you honor your own limits, the more others learn to meet you where you truly are, not where it is convenient for them that you be. The power of boundaries is that they do not just protect you from harm, they allow your essence to take shape. Without boundaries, your identity remains amorphous, reactive, overly adaptive, but as you claim your space, even if quietly and gently, your outline becomes clearer. You become visible to yourself, perhaps for the first time. You begin to differentiate between obligation and desire, between habit and authenticity. You begin to notice how often you moved out of guilt instead of intention, how many choices you made simply to avoid disappointing others. In setting boundaries, you are not closing doors. You are opening one essential door back to yourself. This reclamation is not dramatic. It does not need declarations or defenses. It simply begins when you say no without apology, when you choose rest without justification, when you stop explaining your worth through how useful you are to others. Slowly, you notice a shift, not just in how others respond to you, but in how you respond to yourself. You trust yourself more, you feel safer in your own presence, your thoughts become clearer because your mind is no longer preoccupied with maintaining unsustainable dynamics. Your relationships deepen, not because you're giving more, but because what you give is now offered freely, not from pressure or fear, and in this space of form and boundary, life begins to meet you differently. Opportunities come that match your values rather than your desperation. People approach you with respect rather than assumption. You attract clarity rather than confusion, alignment rather than performance. You begin to see that boundaries are not restrictions. They are invitations to real, sustainable, reciprocal connection, rooted in mutual recognition rather than unspoken expectation. True presence does not arise from constant availability, but from depth, from intention, from the capacity to be fully where you are without being stretched. thin across 100 moments that are not your own. There is a strange paradox that begins to unfold when you step back and become less accessible. The very absence you fear will make you forgotten begins to shape a deeper presence that lingers in ways your constant doing never could. People may initially notice your silence with confusion or even frustration, but over time, they begin to feel the difference between availability that is habitual and presence that is deliberate. There is something in the energy of a person who is no longer reacting to every call, who no longer moves from urgency, that changes the rhythm of every interaction. It is not aloofness, not detachment, but a kind of groundedness that says, I am here not because I must be, but because I choose to be. When you remove yourself from the machinery of endless interaction, something profound happens to your attention. What was once dispersed becomes concentrated, what was once reflexive becomes reflective, and in this concentrated state, your presence carries a different weight. Your words may become fewer, but they are rooted. Your gestures may be quieter, but they are anchored. This shift is not just noticed, it is felt. Others may not be able to articulate what has changed in you, but they sense it in the space you occupy, in the way you listen, in the way you no longer reach to fill silence or meet every expectation before it is spoken. Your absence has made room for your presence to become real. The value of anything increases when it is rare, not because rarity alone is virtuous, but because it forces us to pay attention. When you are no longer always available, those who seek your presence must meet it with their own. They must come with more than demands. They must come with respect, with consideration, with intentionality. Your absence filters out the noise. It reveals who is truly attuned to your presence and who is simply leaning on your accessibility. And this filtration is not about judgment or rejection. It is about discovering where true reciprocity lies, where energy flows both ways instead of in a single direction that leaves you emptied and unseen. There is a deeper kind of connection that arises in this space, not born from repetition or routine, but from mutual recognition. It is the connection that emerges when both people are whole, when neither is using the other as a crutch or a distraction. When you are less available, you create the conditions for this kind of connection to take shape, because you are no longer showing up from depletion, from habit, from fear of being left out or forgotten. You show up when it is real, when it resonates, when your presence can be fully given rather than extracted. This shift makes your presence magnetic, not because you are withholding yourself, but because your energy is no longer diluted. The sacredness of presence begins in the decision to step away from the superficial, to stop measuring your worth by how much you give and how often you are seen. In that decision, you begin to understand that being present is not a quantity but a quality. It is not about how much time you give, but how deeply you inhabit the time you do give. And the more you honor that depth in yourself, the more you invite others to do the same. You become an invitation, not to constant engagement, but to real encounter. In this way, absence becomes a teacher. It does not ask you to vanish, but to reappear differently. It asks you to re-enter your life from the center rather than the edges, to show up in relationships not as a responder to need, but as a steward of meaning. The space you once filled out of obligation becomes a space you fill with intention, and what you bring into that space now carries the essence of who you are becoming rather than the remnants of who you thought you had to be. There comes a quiet reckoning when you stop defining yourself by your availability, when you no longer rush to fill silence or soothe discomfort just to prove you are good, needed, or worthy. What rises in this space is not arrogance, but an unfamiliar self, one that has been waiting beneath the masks you've worn, beneath the compulsions that once made you say yes even when you meant no. This self is not polished or perfect. It is raw, unedited, closer to instinct than performance. It does not care much for appearances or approval because it remembers something older, something that existed before you learned to edit yourself for belonging. And when this self begins to stir, it does so gently but insistently, asking questions you may not be ready to answer, pulling at the seams of the roles you've outgrown, the personas you've maintained out of fear. You begin to notice how often your actions were guided not by what felt true, but by what felt safe. How often you offered time, affection, or energy not because it was freely given, but because it felt dangerous to withhold. This is not weakness, it is adaptation, the kind that develops over years of learning that love may be conditional, that approval may require performance, that to belong may mean to disappear a little. But when you stop being so readily available, when you no longer move reflexively to meet every external need, that adaptation starts to unravel, and with it comes grief, not only for what was lost, but for what was never allowed to fully live. You grieve the self you silenced to be accepted, the boundaries you dissolved to be embraced, the truths you buried so your presence would not feel like an inconvenience. This grief is not a failure. It is a passage. It means something in you is waking up, something that no longer wants to be an echo of other people's desires. And as that something wakes, it becomes less interested in appeasement and more curious about authenticity. You begin to see that the constant reaching, pleasing, managing, and proving was a way of surviving, not living. And survival, while noble, is not the same as presence. It does not nourish the soul. It keeps you moving, yes, but in circles. It keeps you engaged, but not aligned. When you stop being available in the way you always were, you stop spinning those circles, and in that stillness, direction becomes possible again. The self that emerges in this stillness is not loud. It does not declare its value or demand recognition. It simply exists, unhurried, uninterested in drama or performance. It begins to listen, not to the noise of obligation, but to the quiet pulses of inner truth. It begins to reclaim desire, not the kind imposed by culture or family or fear, but the desire that grows from within like a root seeking water. This desire is honest. It may lead you away from what once felt essential. It may ask you to let go of roles, of relationships, of rhythms that no longer reflect your truth. And it may feel, at first, like loss. But this too is part of the turning, the shedding, the reconstitution of a life no longer shaped by fear of being alone or unseen. As this process unfolds, you stop needing to be everything for everyone. You stop measuring your worth by how exhausted you are or how often you are needed. You begin to understand that value does not come from depletion, that love does not require self-erasure, and slowly the self that once lived in the margins begins to step into the center. It moves quietly but with certainty, not to perform but to simply be. It becomes enough, not because it has been validated, but because it has been reclaimed. And in that reclamation, the need to constantly be available dissolves, replaced by something deeper, steadier, something that does not shout, but holds its ground with grace. So, when you stop being available, everything indeed changes, but not because the world changes. You do, and in that shift, the world reorganizes around your new center of gravity. In this deliberate absence, you reclaim the sacred space where true connection, genuine purpose, and inner clarity emerge. To withdraw is not to abandon, it is to return to yourself. Thank you.